one.
Right, this is team two, and we are looking at the social and ecological effects of interactions between disease-carrying mosquitoes and humans. So the big question here is why should we care about this relationship between humans and disease-carrying mosquitoes? I think everybody can agree that um, controlling disease that affect humans is a good thing. So we're looking specifically at methods for and the ethics of mosquito control. The understanding of this is vitally important, that we understand the disease control tactics and how we can communicate that on a worldwide level. Furthermore, this is going to help us to correlate disease transmission with control methods and at the same time be able to respect the environment and practice ethical science.
Okay, so a couple other things to consider is the social and ecological factors that influence mosquito-borne diseases. So the first social factor that you can really consider is human mobility. Anytime you've got people who are constantly moving to different areas, that can impact how much spread from those diseases is had. A study showed that human mobility into high transmission rural areas tends to increase the risk of contracting malaria, and just common things throughout the day, such as going to work, increase the mobility of these diseases within the areas. Another thing to consider is changes in farming practices nowadays, with the more modern farming practices that have changed from before, and things such as deforestation, intensification of livestock production, and habitat fragmentation. All of these have increased contact between humans, livestock, and wildlife, which can then obviously increase the potential for disease spread. General population density is another very important thing. A study was done, and it was found that, um, shoot, I just lost myself in my notes there. But pretty much the research showed that the ideal temperature for transmission, it found an ideal temperature, and it showed that defensiveness within a population can lead to that temperature kind of shifting around. Lastly, tourism, which is kind of similar to human mobility a little bit. But a study was done in Miami that was able to that designated multiple testing sites there, and it showed that within the sites, that there was just an increased spread at different times of the year, most often associated with travel. These are going to be the late spring, early summer times. So those are the social factors.
Was it
Next, we will go
Alicia
into
or Lexi doing the ecological factors?
Alicia, I thought you were talking about the ecological
No,
factors.
I'm doing slide 7, sorry.
Okay. So for the ecological factors, we have rural and urban areas, and we're going to talk about how those play into influencing mosquito-borne illnesses. We're also going to speak about deforestation, warmer temperatures, and the environmental shifts, such as climate change, that influences populations, which affect disease transmission.
Elaborating more on rural versus urban areas and intensified agricultural practices. Some mosquito-borne diseases like malaria are more prevalent in rural areas than in urban areas. Rural areas present more intensified agricultural practices, as listed before, deforestation, intensification of livestock production, and habitat fragmentation. These contribute to the spread of zoonotic diseases such as malaria by increasing contact between humans, livestock, and wildlife, such as mosquitoes, and creating more breeding habitats, like sunlit pools of water and edge environments for mosquitoes, in order for them to reproduce more and create a larger population of them in those areas. Also, urban areas have conditions that contribute to decreased malaria rates, such as housing, drainage network, and pavements. Those two things decrease pools of water, which we know are breeding habitats for mosquitoes, and as well as easier access to healthcare. Easier access to healthcare would just allow for a more speedy process of treating malaria once obtained. While residence areas show to be a stronger factor for increasing transmission rates of malaria, human mobility does play a role. Um, there was a study that focused on Alto Jurua, Brazil, which is a region that has the highest cases of malaria in the Amazon. It showed that urban residents exhibit a larger increase in the probability of contracting malaria when spending time in rural areas of Alta Jurua. Shown on the graph here, ML stands for Mancio Lima, RA stands for Rodriguez Alves, which are just two regions in Alto Jurua. The most important thing to note here is the U and the R that are at the end of these abbreviations. U stands for urban areas and R stands for rural areas. And you can see in both regions, spending the same amount of time, you can see there is a higher chance of contracting malaria in rural areas, as you can see in both.
Okay, so the second idea of our evaluation that we wanted to talk about is the interactions between mosquito-borne illness and humans. So there was a first study done that was basically about the mosquito salivary antigens and how they were related to the dengue and P. vivax malaria. So as we know, humans or mosquitoes feed on humans, and when they do, their saliva is released, and with this, any pathogens and disease is released with their saliva. So the saliva or the salivary proteins regulate host immune responses and cause infection. There was another study done about the Anopheles, which are malaria vectors, and then the Aedes, which are the dengue vectors, and basically just analyzing how they coexist with each other. So they were able to find that exposure to saliva from multiple mosquito species causes transmission and pathogenesis. Also, mosquito location and ecology directly influences human exposure risk and disease outcome. So kind of like bouncing off of the first article or the first experiment, within that, they also were using IgG antigens as markers for bite exposure and possible disease risk. So they kind of use this like antigen as a pinpoint to prove their study that they were trying to figure out. So the IgG antibodies against the mosquito salivary proteins are reliable markers for the severity of human exposure to mosquito bites.
So in looking at suggestions for mosquito control, a really important factor in this is to make sure that we are doing this responsibly. This goes along with our ethics, which we will get to in a minute, but we also really want to make sure that everything that we are doing in order to control mosquitoes are taking into account the population of the people nearby and also the environment. So there are a few different suggestions that we have found. One is a use of a green microalgae, which actually is fed on by the mosquito larvae. In this study, it was discovered that at least in studying specific zebrafish as a method for determining whether or not it was going to be destructive to the surrounding environment, it was found that only the mosquito larvae actually fed on this, and any that were outside of mosquito larvae suffered no consequences of that. So it would seem that the green microalgae is a very effective way to control mosquito populations while at the same time respecting the environment around it. Furthermore, fungus has been used as an insecticide, which showed efficiency in controlling that mosquito population, much like the green microalgae, and at the same time did not harm the surrounding environment. We've also looked at using adult mosquitoes to transport an insect growth regulator, and using mosquitoes as vectors that can carry out traits that will prevent malaria transmission. And the purpose of this is to outpopulate the other mosquitoes that can actually carry those diseases.
I'll talk a little bit about the last point here. A study was done in which they figured out that a low technology emanator was able to discourage mosquitoes from actually landing on people within like its radius, and then obviously effectively reducing them biting and then transmitting the disease. So this is shown to be very effective with yielding a 70 to 90% reduction when the study was taken. And it was further concluded that strategic placement of multiple of these low technology emanators could could give a very promising result in reducing the amount of disease transmission.
And I'll touch more on point four, where they were using mosquitoes as vectors to carry out traits to prevent malaria transmission. As research was done where scientists were genetically modifying mosquitoes and weakening the malaria parasite Plasmodium that was inside their bodies. And this was a more gene-driven research that was done because it would ensure that all the offspring, or nearly all of them, would actually not be able to transmit any more malaria to anyone based off of how mosquitoes actually breed. So all of their traits basically would be passed off to their offspring. And this would obviously create this more, the gene would spread rapidly. So the malaria would actually be, and we wouldn't have to rely on insecticides solely for the malaria. And it would significantly cut out transmission rates, obviously. And so, yeah.
And just another thing for the suggestions for mosquito control. Another study shown in China suggested three things for mosquito control in regards to dengue. They suggested to plant more vegetation for cover to help shade areas and lower temperatures. So, as we mentioned before, those increased temperatures kind of are a good breeding ground for mosquito growth and larvae growth as well. So making areas that are more shaded will lower those temperatures and will help lower those population numbers. Another suggestion was to increase mosquito control and start it earlier. So some of those suggestions that we had talked about before, using those low technology and those using mosquitoes as vectors and other things like that will and starting those things sooner will help keep people from getting dengue sooner. And also another thing that they mentioned was to inform tourists of the risks of dengue and how to avoid it. So teaching them like to use their mosquito repellent, how to avoid those diseases will help them keep from getting dengue.
So after we've talked about all the different suggestions to control mosquitoes, it's really important to focus on the ethics of these mosquito control studies and the attempts that we're making. There are a lot of concerns about genetically modified insects or things that could potentially harm the environment. We touched on that before with the green microalgae and how this does not affect the environment, but the ethics go further than that. We really need to look at informing people. There was a study done in Brazil where the mosquito population was very successfully controlled. It was a small village that was chosen. The problem was that none of the residents were made aware of the fact that this study was going to occur. All of the experimentation was done without any foreknowledge or consent of the people who lived in that village. So that it really highlights a need for political accountability and what they called responsible innovation, where we are doing things consciously and ethically. A way that we can do that is in laboratory studies. A lot of times, bovine blood is being used, which brings into account the fact that other animals are being sacrificed in order to make this happen. So, to more ethically do this, they came up with a synthetic blood substitute that they can use as opposed to bovine blood, and it seems to be just as good in laboratory studies. So that shows that good ethics, even in laboratory, are very possible. And lastly, we really just need to focus on greater trust and transparency whenever we're making these efforts to control mosquito populations, letting the population know that reside in the area they're going to be doing their experimentations is vital. People need to have a voice in this. They don't just need to be told after the fact. We need to show good ethics in the laboratory and how we are handling things relating to the environment around them.
So as we can see with all of these, the ecology, the sociology, prevention and control, and ethics, they all kind of work with each other to intertwine into one big idea about mosquito-borne disease patterns. So they collectively show us that disease transmission cannot be understood from a single perspective, but we have to consider human, environmental, and biological interactions within all of the experiments and analysis.
This information is actually helpful because we can use it to develop integrated public health strategies. We can use it to improve climate adaptation plans, information global efforts to control vector-borne diseases in tropical and urban environments. So all of the things that we have discussed before, we can use those things. It will help us to further come up with more ideas to solve these problems and help us further. So that about wraps up our presentation for today. We hope that you enjoyed hearing our talk, and thank you so much.